Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to a new video. If you watch some of my painting videos, you know that I use a variety of brushes. In this video I will go into more detail about the brushes that I use. I use a variety of brushes, all of which are derived from default Photoshop brushes. First I will talk a little bit about the brushes and how I use them. After that I will show you how you can use the brush settings to get interesting brushes. Make sure to subscribe to the channel if you like this video, also consider hitting that like button. And now without further ado, let's get started. So here we are in Photoshop to show you the different brushes. The brush that I mainly use lately is this chalk brush. I think it comes default from Photoshop. I made some slight adjustments to it, but it's basically a sort of a big brush with a little bit of texture to it. There's no opacity settings or anything, so you can really use this to block stuff in. I'm quickly going over the brushes, and then I'm gonna talk a little bit more about the settings. I also got this big flat brush, which I mainly use for landscaping. It's really nice. Those I don't really use. Sometimes I use this one. As you can see, it's really random, and I use that to sort of set up a quick painting scene. If I want to throw on some color on a painting, I might use this brush to just throw on some no, not really random, but throw on the colors that I want, and from there on start the painting. Then we got these really small brushes, which I mainly use to draw little things. If I want to do a line drawing, I usually use these brushes. Sometimes I use a small round brush, which also really works nice. And I got a slightly different variation with that. But these are sort of all variations on the same theme. And then I got three more brushes. This is a slightly different and smaller variant than that one, with the thickness of the brush set to pen pressure, but with a minimum width. So if I press really lightly, that is even too much pressure already. You can see the line is fairly thin, and that's maximum pressure. So there's not a whole lot of difference between those two. I got two more brushes. These brushes I started using with painting the city scene. It's a quite harsh brush, as you can see, and it's a really good brush, this one, for hard surfaces like buildings and vehicles and stuff like that, in which you don't really want that much texture. So you can use this one. And then I use this one. This is essentially the same brush, but with the opacity setting set to the pen pressure. So the harder I press on my pen, the bigger the opacity. And I find this a really good brush to use for sort of shiny features, like a glass globe or shiny surfaces. That's the word I was looking for. It's a really cool one to use for shiny surfaces. And this is actually almost all of the brushes that I use. And there's one more brush, and you probably know that already if you saw my videos, which is the big soft brush. And I use that one to sort of put down atmospheric perspective on my painting. So I use that in combination with the lasso tool. I'm currently using the marquee tool, but normally use the lasso tool to select a bit and then use that brush to sort of paint the selection. And those are the brushes that I use. I also vary the opacity setting during painting. Currently it is set at 100, as you can see here in at the top, but I vary it anywhere between 30 and 80%. I never really paint on 100%, so I am almost always, the maximum I go up to is 90, but I barely use it. Most of the time it's set at 80% opacity. And this gives you the opportunity to blend the colors a little bit better. And if you want more color blend, you can set it lower. For instance, 50% opacity gives you a little bit more control, and that allows you to blend colors together. But don't be afraid to use the 80 or 90% opacity. It really helps putting down strong lines, and I was afraid to do that in the beginning. I was quite afraid to do that. But if you don't really use the higher opacity settings, your painting sort of looks kind of blurred. So that's why I use the higher opacity settings. So these are the brushes that I use, and now we go to the part where I modify a brush a little bit, so you can see how you can achieve certain effects with your brush. So here we are in a blank new canvas in Photoshop, and let's grab a brush. This is the default Photoshop brush that's already sort of modified. What brush do we want to use? I think I'm gonna use one of the chalk brushes. I don't really use round brushes. I find the chalk brushes really nice. Let's set it to 100. No, let's set it to 90% opacity and get a black. So this is sort of the default brush stroke. It's a sort of almost square brush, and you can use this to paint. That's perfectly viable. You can vary the opacity settings by I do that by pressing the keys, the 1 to 0 keys on top of my keyboard. The 1 key is 10% opacity, the 0 key is 100% opacity. So if you want 40% opacity, you just press the 4 and you have 40% opacity. That's a really neat trick as well to remember, because it makes you really flexible, so you don't have to go in there and use the slider. That takes up time. You can just put in the key and the brush will do it for you. So what things do we have? I'm gonna go through this quickly. If you want some more detail, I may do another video in which I go into it with more detail, but you get these settings here on the brush. For instance, the shape dynamics, and you can change anything from the size jitter. That basically means that the size sort of gets different each time. As you can see, that the brush has rough edges now because it slightly varies the size every time. You can also set the size to pen pressure. We control the size here with pen pressure. As you can see, if you set the minimum diameter all the way back, when we have a very small pen pressure, we get a very small brush. Pressed harder, we get a bigger brush. But I always like to use a bit of a minimum diameter here, because the bigger the difference between the two sizes of the brush, the minimum and the maximum size, the harder it is to control. And you can easily adjust the size of your brush by pressing the bracket keys on your keyboard, which is really really helpful. So that's, I think, a better way to do that. Then you can play with the angle and the roundness of the brush, so you get a more sort of a random brush. But I don't think those are too useful. And normally I don't really use a size jitter either, because I want a nice consistent brush. Scattering, we're not gonna get into the details yet, because maybe in another video, but it isn't really useful for this video. Texture is really nice. It allows you to, and you can download different textures, and there is a folder which you can put those. But it allows you to add a texture to your brush, and you can sort of change the texture, the depth of the texture, so how deep the texture goes into your brush. As you can see, if you have a really deep texture, the brush really changes. Let's zoom in a little bit so we can see it better. So you can see there's a big sort of texture in this brush, and you can find a nice setting in which you have a nice texture and you like it. You can also set the depth jitter, so the depth isn't really consistent throughout the entire brush stroke, and that helps adding a little bit of variety. You can also adjust the minimum depth, so the minimum depth, might want to set it really deep or not deep at all. And you can change on how the texture interacts with your brush. And one thing you can do as well is add, let's set the minimum depth really high. Put in a new piece of the canvas. You can set the scale. So let's say that this is fairly small, I believe, and now you have a really big. So that isn't really showing for this texture, but oh, this one is almost the same with the small scale, but half scale. It's different here, but on the canvas it's not that different. But this is a really handy tool to add some texture, and especially for landscapes. You can play with it around a little bit, and then you can have some nice interactions going on. Dual brush is also a really nice way to add some extra texture. You can basically choose another brush, and it makes a sort of a combination of both of the brushes, and it sometimes really gets you nice effects with different textures. So you can see there is different effects that we can achieve, and there is also different settings here in which you can adjust the way that the two brushes interact. Color dynamics, I don't really find it very useful, and then we have the other dynamics. We're not gonna get into these bottom ones. That's for maybe for a later video. Mainly because I don't really use those things. I probably should experiment with them a little bit. With the other dynamics, you get the opacity jitter or the opacity settings. You can set it to pen pressure, and basically that means that your pen. This is a nice fur brush. Wow, we created a new brush for fur or something like that. That's really cool. I think we made a really nice new brush here. I'm gonna save that brush. So I'm gonna quickly talk a little bit more about it. So you can set the opacity to pen pressure. I'm still not sure what flow does. It sort of makes the edges a little bit it's basically sort of a size thing, I guess. The end of the brush stroke being a little bit smaller than the middle, so to speak, so the brush flows a little bit. I really like this brush, so we're gonna save that brush. I'm gonna quickly show you how to do it. It's really easy. Just put it down here with that little bucket tool. You can name it, and we're gonna call it Cool New Brush. There we go, and it's saved now, so we can select different brushes and paint it. And if you want to go back to that same brush with the settings that we have, we can get back to it. It's a really nice tool. So I hope that this was a useful video, that you learned something from it. Yeah, that's it. Thank you for watching. If you liked it, please consider giving it a like and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more videos in the future. Next week, hopefully we're gonna have a normal painting video again, and we will also have a new update on the daily thumbnail sketches, because that's going quite well and I'm really enjoying myself. Thank you for watching, and see you next week. Bye.